Today is November 17th, 2023. Today, my daddy died. He was 77. He was a good man. Today, I want to talk about the type of man he was. Dad grew up with grandma and his two sisters. And his dad left when he was really young. And he once told me they had to move from Mathis to George West. He said they didn't have anything to eat in the house. And so grandma told him and his sisters, hey, we're going to have to go live with my brother in George West. And that's how they ended up in George West. Dad, very young, didn't have much. As a matter of fact, we did a podcast early on when I first started. He was my first two. And he talked about how he didn't even have shoes for Little League or a glove. He used to use his cap as a glove, and he used borrowed sandals to play in. People would pick on him and make fun of him. And eventually, at some point, his coaches took him out to eat and bought him some cleats and glove and stuff, and he was super excited about it. But that kind of stuff stuck with him his whole life. Dad was a good dude. Dad wasn't always a good dude. Dad got into a lot of trouble. He did a lot of things he probably shouldn't have when he was younger. But at his core, he was always a good guy. And I think a lot of that was probably his uncle and, of course, his mother. And wanting to be there for his mom and wanting to be there for his sisters. And be a provider at an early age. He stopped going to school in the 7th grade because he started working full-time to help grandma out and his sisters. So Dad didn't have a formal education. But Dad was very educated. I've said before, my dad lived the type of life that as he grew older, he had a master's degree in life. He knew what to look for when people were hurting. He knew what to look for when people were lost. He knew what to look for when somebody needed something. And he knew what to look for because he had lived that life and he had been there too. Dad was never afraid to help somebody. In talking to him, I understand, he had his rough patches growing up. When I was a kid, I always remember Dad just being amazing. Dad was always fun, even when he was an alcoholic. I thought he was fun. Mom might not have thought so. The town may not have thought so. His buddies thought he was hilarious. Dad had a lot of friends. Dad was the go-to guy. He was very social. He was funny. He was a bit of a smart ass, which is where we get it from. He always hated when we hacked on each other as siblings or made fun of our friends. He would always get after us and tell us we shouldn't do that. We should have respect for each other. But he always knew in the back of his head we were like that because he was like that. We got it from somewhere. Dad was huge into respect and being compassionate. Dad, at some point, Mom was really sick, and Dad had already had a bunch of life experiences, and he talked about going to a retreat with Mom in Laredo, and that's when he said, I was sitting in the front with your mom, and the priest brought the Holy Eucharist through, and they walked by me, and I fell to my knees. He said, I fell to my knees, and I started crying. I didn't want to cry. I didn't want to be on my knees. I couldn't get up. I couldn't stop crying. After that weekend, Dad came back to town. And he was always a functioning alcoholic. But when he came back to town, he never had another drink again. And Dad's life changed through his faith. Dad became a very spiritual guy, strong in his faith, always learning. And it was interesting for a guy that I never saw really read a book or do mathematics. His head was always in the Bible, always studying. He loved to have little study groups. And he loved it so much that even when the Jehovah's Witnesses would come by the house, they would stop coming because Dad wouldn't let them leave. Because Dad loved to talk about the Bible. And he tried to instill it in us. And you know, it's interesting because a lot of times we didn't want to participate. But even though the bits and pieces that were kind of pushed on us, I'm glad that they were, because as we got older, we started to revert and rely on those things that we were taught, because at some point we quit learning ourselves. I like to tell people a few stories about the man that raised me. And I always say, you want to know how I was raised? Let me tell you. When I was about 5, I remember Dad was watching wrestling. He loved wrestling. He's a huge wrestling fan and made us wrestling fans. This is back in the day, though. And I would turn the TV off. It had a little power button on it, and I would hit it and turn it off, and he'd get up and he'd say, don't do that. I'm watching TV. Don't do it. If you do it, I'm going to spank you. Me being the youngest and the way that I was, you couldn't tell me anything. So I'd wait for him to sit down, and I'd turn it off, and he'd get up and he'd spank me. We did that about 5 times. And then on the 6th time, I went to pretend to turn it off, and he got up and he spanked me. And he said, if you're going to pretend to do something, you may as well do it, because I'm going to spank you. He was teaching me consequences. Another time, I was probably 16. He asked what I was going to do for the day, and I said, probably just watch cartoons. He says, well, why don't you go mow the yard? And I said, well, I'd love to, Dad, but the mower's broke. I knew the mower was broke because I broke it. Dad caught the smart tone of my voice, and he made me mow the front yard, the backyard, Mr. Allen's front yard, and my Aunt Elda's front yard with a weed eater. It took me all day. Another time, this is a little more funny, but it's probably not funny to my sister. She was washing dishes. We'd always pick on each other, and I'd bring dishes late when she was draining the water out of the sink, and we'd always do that stuff to each other. One day she wanted to watch her show, and she says, hey, do me a favor, finish these dishes. And I said, no. I turned around and looked, Dad's in the living room, and I go, no. Dishes are a girl's job. And as soon as I said that, I turned around, and Dad was directly behind me. And Dad says, what did you say? And I said, I didn't say anything. He said, no, you said something. He said, you said it once. Be man enough to say it again. And I said, well, Dad, I said dishes were a girl's job, but I was just kidding. Dad made me do dishes every night from the 6th grade till I was 20 and left his house. I get some relief from Vidal and some of the other ones, but it was every night. And it was because Gabe had a big mouth. Dad was big on that. Dad was big on respecting others and respecting especially the women in our house. He made sure that we knew where he stood on that. We were Bear's kids. And I'm proud to be one of Bear's kids. It was always instilled in us, when you leave this house, you're a representative of the family. You're a representative of me. So behave yourself. And we weren't always the best at it, but that was always in the back of our head. We were a little bit better than what some of our behavior was, because we were Bear's kids. Dad was the type of guy that would help everyone. We lived in a house that had holes in the floor, and whatever the weather was outside was the weather inside. One of my favorite things to do today even is, when we were younger, we'd always end up with deer meat because Dad used to be a butcher. So a lot of times we'd get calls by the game warden to go process deer, and we rarely hunted. We'd do every now and then, but we always had meat because Dad was the town butcher, And Dad, to keep the house warm, he would turn the oven on low, throw some deer meat in there with some soy sauce and pepper, and he would just let it bake on low all night long. And it was a way to keep the house warm. And then in the morning, or maybe the evening, we had some deer jerky. It smelled good, kept the house warm, we had something to eat. That was how Dad worked. That's how Dad thought. There was times where Dad did things that might have got him in trouble. I hope this doesn't get my mom in trouble because she works the same place. But when he was actively working, he was working at City. This was back in late 90s, early 90s, mid 90s, something. I think it was mid 90s. And I remember Dad would come home after work, especially in the wintertime, and he'd come home, eat dinner, and then he'd leave. And he was tasked with turning off the gas for people who couldn't afford to pay their gas bill. And I'd say, Dad, what are you doing? You're going to get fired. And Dad would say, what am I supposed to do? These people have kids. They need to eat dinner. They need a warm water to take a bath. So he'd go and he would turn their gas back on for a couple hours so they could eat, so they could bathe their kids. And then he'd go back out at night and lock them back up. That's the type of guy Dad was. Dad loved to process deer because it reminded him of the job he had when he was younger. We would go, me and Vidal, Dad would say, hey, Mitchell Pavlik called, he's a game warden. He's got a bunch of deer, we need to go debone. Mitchell would say, hey, you better keep 8. I'm going to keep 2. And so we'd go, and me and Vidal right away would say, no, it's a school night. We can't go on a school night. We never cared about school nights, but we did when it was manual labor. Dad was never a big guy for explaining the reasons why. It was always do it because I told you. And out of love and respect for our father, we did it because he told us. I remember Vidal would work hard, and I would work less hard, and I would complain, And Dad would always just say, be quiet and do what I told you. And I would complain. Never thought much about it because I'd go home, take a shower, go to sleep, and didn't think about what he had to do. Didn't think about what he would do the next day or in the evenings because I was always concerned with what I had going on. Find out later, our freezer was always full, but we still went to go get deer and process deer. And the next day, it'd be because Dad was taking it to people who didn't have food. Dad knew we weren't really poor, we were broke. Dad knew there was people who were poor. That was Dad's priority. I don't feel guilty about complaining. Hell, if he'd have explained it to me, I would have complained less. But that was Dad. I'd come home from living out of town, and there'd be somebody parked in front of the house, and I'd get off and ask them what they needed, and they say, well, we bought a washer and dryer. We need to get it in the house. We're waiting for Bear to get home. And so I knew Dad needed help. So I'd say, you know what? I'll take care of it for you. Go to their house, unload their washer and dryer, take the old one out, put the new one in. So Dad didn't have to do it, but he would have done it. But that's who Dad was. Some people really relied on him for that. And he never complained about it. He never wished that he'd get a break. Dad lived a life that didn't allow him to feel bad for himself. Because he was always in need of something So he never thought about what he didn't have. He just knew he had to keep going forward. He needed to provide for his family. He needed to provide for his children. Hell, Dad helped feed a lot of other kids that were friends of ours. I never thought much about it. I just knew that that's what we did. But people were hungry, and he knew it. And he did his best to help people. Dad's favorite thing was sports, especially baseball and softball. He loved to play when he was younger. He would tell me how when he was a kid, a bunch of ranches and farms would get baseball teams together. Mostly their employees, and they would play other ranches and farms. And Grandma would let them go to Laredo to play for this one rancher, and the guy would feed him some weird meat. Sometimes it was armadillo. Give him $5, and he felt like a professional athlete. Back then, he may have been one. But then Dad coached. Dad coached a lot of years, and he loved that. Coached men's, women's, then Little League, baseball, softball, coached us. And then when we got older, he didn't have any more kids to coach. So he just kept coaching. And he made all the other kids his. He loved it. He was such a student of the game because he knew the game real well. But he also knew how the game was tied into life. I've gotten a lot of really good messages from people. Talk about how Dad made an impact on him. And the connective tissue through all of those people and Dad is a little white baseball or a little white softball. Dad had a 7th grade education, but he knew how to use a little white baseball to teach people about life. He's fucking genius. Dad would give things away. Dad would take care of people even when he knew he couldn't afford to, but it didn't matter because they needed it and he would find a way. It got real rough for Dad when he couldn't see very well anymore, and he was worried about getting hit with a ball, and it was time to stop coaching, and that really bothered him. But every now and then somebody would come by and say, "Hey, Bear, teach my daughter how to pitch. Teach my kid how to throw or hit." And man, he got so excited. He loved that stuff. As Dad got older, he started experiencing more pains, more ailments, more medical issues. And he went from being a really strong guy, fully capable. And over the years, and it happens to everybody, he's not the first, but less and less capable. But he still didn't lose his compassion. He still didn't lose his love for others. And he still maintained who he was, even as he got older, couldn't see so well, couldn't walk. He was still Bear Molina, just in a different form. I look back on these last few years, and I try and remember the older times because those are the better ones. But these last few years, he's had a rough go medically and losing Eddie. Losing Eddie broke a heart that was already weak. It really hurt him. But he still kept pressing on. With Mom's help, with Barbara's help, Vidal, Joe, myself. But he kept pressing on. He never lost faith. He never lost love for his family. The only thing difference was he couldn't help people the way he used to. And I know that bothered him too. Dad always had time for folks. Dad always had time for somebody else's kids. Dad loved kids. Dad had 5 well-intentioned assholes, but so many more kids that he enjoyed as well through coaching and teaching about life. I think that would, if I had to think about Dad's legacy, it would be teaching kids about life, even when they weren't his. He treated them like they were his. And I wish I would have understood that earlier on. All day long I've been thinking about Dad and, of course, the situation. And I kept coming back to misery. And I kept thinking about blessings in that misery. Things that he endured. Things that the families endured with him. And how much good stuff came out of the bad stuff. There were times we'd go see him in the hospital because we thought we were going to lose him. And as you get older, you make less and less time for people, your parents, your family, your friends. Life gets busy. It's difficult. These last, a few months, he was going into a hyperbaric chamber to try and save his right leg. He had already lost his left. And it was 80 days, every day, of somebody, Mom, me, Joe, Barbara, Vidal, getting up early, getting him loaded in the car at 6:30, getting him to Corpus by 7:45, loading him in the hyperbaric chamber, picking him up at 10:30, 11 o'clock, taking him home, or if it was Monday, Wednesday, or Friday, we'd take him to dialysis. We'd drop him off at dialysis, take his car back to the house so Mom could pick him up after work. That was 80 days in a row. He was in so much pain. He was so tired. It was difficult to see your daddy in that much pain. But in a real screwed up way, the blessing was getting to spend time with Dad that we never did just on our own. We did, but this was forced. It was every day. One of us got to spend half a day with Dad, one-on-one. Most of the time he was in a lot of pain. But every now and then he'd crack a joke. He'd say something funny, or he'd make fun of Mom. Barbara had her own experience with him, and I had one too, where we're on the other side of Mathis, and he's holding his leg and rubbing it because he kept having really painful nerve pain. And it killed me to hear him be in pain like that. And then he'd look up and he'd go, oh, sunrise is beautiful. And he'd go back to rubbing his leg. I said, here's a guy, the end of his life, in complete pain, doesn't know what his future is. Hyperbarics isn't working. He still takes a split second to remind you to look at the beautiful sunrise. That was Dad. Always coaching. He was excited because he was losing his limbs, but he was excited because there was an opportunity. There was an opportunity to maybe walk again, even if it was just to the restroom. That made him so excited. So even though those 80 trips didn't pay off, we weren't recognizing what the payoff was. It wasn't saving Dad's leg, even though that was the goal. Turns out the payoff was getting some one-on-one time with him before we lost him. Dad was a good dude. If you don't believe me, go down to Live Oak County and ask who Bear Molina is. Most people will tell you. I'm proud to be his son. I'm proud of my siblings. I'm glad he's with Eddie. I'm glad he's with Grandma. He's not in pain anymore. Dad lived a rough life, but it was a life worth living, and he lived it to the fullest. I think Dad, at a certain point, was ready to go, maybe a couple years ago, if not more. But he loved Mom, and he didn't want to leave her behind by herself. And he hung on. He hung on as long as he could. Today was a rough day. When we lost Eddie, that was rough as well. Eddie was young. Dad was not young. Eddie's loss felt like a loss. And in a weird way, Dad's loss almost feels like a victory. Because he did so much, and he did what he needed to do. I think he was hanging on for us. But it was time for him to go. Today's November 17th, 2023. Today my daddy died. Today's my birthday. And it's hard, but in a screwed up little weird kind of way. I'm blessed. I'm blessed to have had the dad that I had and to be able to share them with people that I love. I'm blessed that my birthday will always be connected to his death day. I'm blessed for that. It'll never be the same. It'll always be painful. But if my heart's going to be broken, I'm glad it's for Bear Molina, because he's worth it. It's important to my dad that we continue to be a close family. We were always close. But losing Eddie really kind of put a dent in that. I'm hoping losing Dad puts that back together again. I love my family, and I love my dad. He was a loving father, a loving husband. And he treated people the way that he would want them to treat him and his family. I'm thankful for everybody who loves him. I'm thankful for everybody who respects him. And I wouldn't expect anything less, because he earned it. Love you, Barry. And I'm going to miss you. Kiss Grandma. Kiss Eddie. And we'll see y'all soon. Love you, big guy.